Finally, there were some cast iron stairs to the left and a little bridge which took you up to the level of the platform. Bourbon's boots rattled up the iron steps, and after a few steps, the tunnel turned to the left and opened, and there were and they were in the station. There was a bright white beam of light in their faces, and visible from the tunnel there was a little table on the side at which sat a man in a strange and unfamiliar old-fashioned gray uniform, wearing a peak cap. "Welcome," he greeted them, averting the flashlight. "Trading or transit?" While Bourbon stated the purpose of their visit, Artyom peered at the Prospect Mir metro station before him. On the platform along the pathways, twilight reigned, but there were arches lighted from the side with a soft yellow light from which Artyom unexpectedly felt a squeeze in his chest. He wanted to be done with all the formalities and to look at what was going on in the station. There, where the arches were, from which the light was coming, so familiar and comforting that it almost hurt. And though it seemed to Artyom that he hadn't seen anything like it before, the sight of this light brought him back to the distant past, and suddenly a strange image appeared to him, a small home flooded with warm yellow light. A woman is half reclined on a wide ottoman, and she is reading a book, but you can't see her face amidst the pistol wallpaper and the dark blue square of the window. The vision flashed in front of his mind, but melted a second later, leaving him puzzled and excited. What had he just seen? Could it be that the weak light coming from the station could project an old slide of his childhood that had been lost in his subconscious onto the invisible screen? Could that young woman who was peacefully reading a book on the spacious and comfortable ottoman be his mother? Artyom impatiently thrust his passport at the customs officer after agreeing, despite Bourbon's objective, to put his machine gun in their storage room for the duration of his visit. Then Artyom hurried along, attracted to the light behind the columns, like a moth towards the light of the den of a bazaar. Prospect Mir was different from VDNKH, from Alexeyevskaya, from Rizskaya. The prosperity of the Hansa meant that they had better illumination than the emergency lights that gave light to the station that Artyom had known during his conscious life. No, these weren't the same lamps that lighted the metro in the old days. They were weak, glowing lights which hung overhead every 20 feet, drawn along a wire that went across the whole station. But for Artyom, who was unused to the cloudy red emergency glow, to the unreliable lights of fire, to the weak radiance from tiny pocket flashlights illuminating the inside of tents, the light at this station was totally strange. It was the same light that lit his early childhood, as far back as the time when life was at the surface, and he was charmed to be reminded of something that had long ago ceased to exist for him. So arriving at the lighted part of the station, Artyom didn't rush into the rows of traders like the others, but leant his back against a column, or leant his back against a column, and partly covering his eyes with his hands, he stood and looked at the lamps again and again until there was a sharp pain in his eyes. You what, gone crazy or something? Why are you staring at them so hard? You want to lose your eyes? You'll be as blind as a puppy, and what'll I do with you? Bourbon's voice resounded in Artyom's ears. You're already gone and given them your balalaika, so you might as well go and have a look around at what the lamps are trying to show you. Artyom cast a hostile look over at Bourbon, but he obeyed him anyway. There weren't all that many people at the station, but they spoke so loudly, trading, beckoning, demanding, trying to out-yell each other, that it became clear why it was all so audible from afar, from the approach to the tunnel. On both tracks there were scraps of train structures, and some wagons were covered for habitation. 2 rows of trays were arranged along the platform that displayed various utensils, some in orderly piles, others in sloppy heaps. On one side of the station there was an iron curtain which stood in the place where there was once an exit to the surface, and on the opposite side there was a line of gray bags which clearly demarcated a line of firing positions. An unnaturally white banner hung from the ceiling, on which was painted a brown circle, the symbol of the ring. Beyond the firing line were 4 escalators which led to the ring circuit, and that's where the territory of the powerful Hansa began, which was close to foreigners. The frontier guards beyond the fences were dressed in waterproof overalls with the usual camouflage, but for some reason they were gray in color. Why do they have gray camouflage? Artyom asked Bourbon. They're fat animals, that's why, he answered contemptuously. You know, you go ahead and look around while I do a little trading here. There was nothing of particular interest to Artyom. There was tea, sticks of sausage, storage batteries for lamps, jackets, and raincoats made from pigskin, some some tattered books, most of which were pornography, half-liter bottles of a suspicious-looking substance with the inscription "Homebrew" written on crooked labels. And there really wasn't one trader selling weed which you used to be able to get a hold of anywhere. Even the gaunt little man with the blue eyes and watery eyes who was selling the dubious homebrew told Artyom to get lost when he asked if he had a little stuff. There was a trader selling firewood, knotty logs and branches that some stalker had brought down from the surface. It was said to burn for a long time and produce little smoke. Here you paid for things in dimly gleaming Kalashnikov. No, in dimly gleaming Kalashnikov cartridges. Here you paid for things in dimly gleaming Kalashnikov cartridges. 100 grams of tea was 5 cartridges. A stick of sausage was 15 cartridges. A bottle of homebrew was 20. They fondly called them little bullets. Listen, man, look at this. What a cool jacket. It's cheap, just 30 little bullets, and it's yours. Okay, 25, and you'll take it now. Looking at the neatly arranged rows of little bullets on the counter, Artyom recollected the words of his stepfather. I once read that Kalashnikov was proud of his invention, that his automatic weapon was the most popular gun in the world. They say that he was particularly happy that thanks to his device, the borders of his homeland were kept safe. I don't know. If I had invented that thing, I think I would have gone mad. To think that most murders have been committed with the help of your device. That's even scarier than being the inventor of the guillotine. 1 cartridge, 1 death, someone's life removed. 100 grams of tea cost 5 human lives. A length of sausage, very cheap, if you please, just 15 lives. The quality leather jacket on sale today, it's just 25, so you're saving 5 lives. The daily exchange at the market was equal to, in lives, to the entire population of the metro. Well, so, did you find anything for yourself? Bourbon came up and asked. Nothing interesting here for me. Artyom brushed the question away. Aha, you're right. It's full of garbage. But boy, this little station used to be the one place in this stinking metro station where you could find everything you want. You go there and they'll all vying with one another. Weapons, narcotics, girls, fake documents, bourbon, side dreamily. But these cretins, he nodded at the Hansa flag, have made this into a nursery school. You can't do this, you can't do that. Okay, let's go and get your hoe. We need to keep going. After getting Artyom's machine gun, they took a seat on the stone bench before entering the southern tunnel. It was murky there, and Bourbon had picked this spot easily in order to get their eyes used to the weaker light. Basically, this is the deal. I can't vouch for myself. I've never done this, and so I don't know what I'm doing and if we'll run into trouble. Touch wood, of course. But even so, if we run into something, well, if I start sniveling or go deaf, then that should be okay. As far as I heard, everybody goes crazy in their own way. Our boys didn't make it back to Prospect. I think that they didn't get far, and we might bump into them today. So you get ready for that, because you're a little soft after all. And if I start to see red, I'll shut you up. That's the problem, you see. I don't know what to do. Well, okay, Bourbon finally felt resolved after his hesitation. Boy, you're all right, I guess. And you won't shoot a guy in the back. I'm going to give you my gun while we go through this passage. Watch it, he warned, looking Artyom tenaciously in the eye. And don't be funny. I have a limited sense of humor. He shook his rags out of his rucksack and then carefully pulled out a machine gun that was wrapped in plastic packaging. It was also a Kalashnikov, but it was cut off like the ones held by the Hansa border guards, with a hinged butt and a short socket instead of a long one that Artyom had. Bourbon took the magazine out of it and put it back in his rucksack, throwing the rags in after it. Hold this, He gave Artyom the weapon, and don't pack it away. It might prove useful. Though the package looks quiet. Though the passage looks quiet. And Bourbon didn't finish his sentence, but jumped onto the pathway. Okay, let's go. The sooner you go, the sooner you get there. It was frightening when they went from BDNK to Rizskaya. Artyom knew that anything could happen, but at least people went back and forth along those tunnels every day, and he knew that there was an inhabited station ahead of them where they were expected. It was just as unpleasant as it always was for anyone leaving a lighted and peaceful place even when they were headed for Prospect Mur from Rizskaya. Despite his doubt, he could amuse himself with the thought that ahead of him lay a Hansa station, that there was somewhere to go where he could relax in safety. But it was terrifying here. The tunnel that lay before him was totally black and unusual. Totally absolute darkness reigned. It was so thick he could almost touch it, as porous as a sponge. It greedily swallowed the rays of their flashlight, which was hardly sufficient to illuminate even a foot ahead. Straining to the limits of his hearing, Artyom attempted to distinguish the smallest germ of that strange and painful noise, but it was in vain. Sounds probably had as hard a time getting through this darkness as light did. Even the bold crashing of Bourbon's boots sounded limp and mute in this tunnel. On the right wall suddenly there was a gap. The flashlight beam sank into a black spot, and Artyom didn't immediately understand that it was simply a side passage which exited sideways from the main tunnel. He looked at Bourbon questioningly. "Don't be scared. There was a transfer passage here," he explained. So that trains could trains could get directly onto the ring without transferring at other stations. But the Hansa filled it in. They're not fools. They wouldn't leave an open tunnel pointing straight at them. After that, they walked in silence for quite a long time, but the silence was getting more and more oppressive, and finally Artyom couldn't bear it. "Listen, Bourbon," he said, trying to disperse any hallucinations. "It is true that some morons attacked a caravan here not long ago." Bourbon didn't answer at once, and Artyom thought that perhaps he hadn't heard the question and was about to repeat it when Bourbon responded. "I heard something like that, but I wasn't here then, so I can't tell you for sure." His words made a dull sound, and Artyom barely caught their sense, and had a hard time separating the words he heard from his own grinding thoughts about the fact that everything was so hard to hear in this tunnel. What? No one saw it? There's stations at either end. How could that be? Where could they have gone? He continued, and not because he was especially interested in the answer, but simply in order to hear his own voice. Several minutes went by before Bourbon replied at last, but this time Artyom hadn't wanted to rush him, because there was an echo of the words he had just said resounding in his head, and he was too busy listening to him. "They say that somewhere here there's a kind of hatch. It's covered over. It's not really visible. Well, how likely is it anyway that you'd see something in the darkness? Bourbon added with a sort of unnatural irritation in his voice. It took some time for Artyom to remember what they were talking about, and he agonizingly tried to catch hold of his senses, of his sense of it, and to pose another question simply because he wanted to continue the conversation. Even if it was clumsy and difficult, it was saving them from silence. And is it always so dark in here? Artyom asked, feeling a bit spooked that his words made such little sound, as though there was something covering his ears. Dark? Yes, always. Everywhere is dark. It comes in, the great darkness, and it shrouds the world, and it will dominate eternally, Bourbon responded, making strange pauses. What's that? A book or something? Artyom said, noticing that he had to make increasing efforts to catch the sound of his own words, and also paying attention to the fact that Bourbon's language had altered in a frightening way. But Artyom didn't have enough strength to be surprised by this. A book? Be afraid of truths concealed in ancient volumes where words are embossed in gold on paper, slate back. They don't decay, Bourbon said ponderously, and Artyom was struck by the thought that the man wasn't turning to speak to him as he had before. Beautiful, Artyom almost yelled. Where does it come from? And beauty will be overthrown and crushed, and the prophets will choke, endeavoring to pronounce their premonitions. For a day, the future will be blacker than their most ominous fears, and what would they see will poison their reason, Bourbon continued quietly. Suddenly he stopped, and he turned his head to the left so sharply at Artyom that Artyom could hear how his vertebrae cracked, and he looked Artyom straight in the eye. Artyom started and stepped backwards. Artyom started and stepped backwards, groping for his machine gun just in case. Bourbon looked at it with wide eyes open, but his pupils were contracted into two tiny dots, even though in the pitch black darkness of the tunnel they should have been thrown open to their limits in an attempt to capture as much light as possible. His face seemed unnaturally peaceful. Not one muscle was tense, and there was even a contemptuous smile which had just disappeared from his lips. I've died, Bourbon said. there is no more me. And as straight as a cross tie, he fell face down. And then that same terrible sound, that same terrible sound rushed into Artyom's ears. But this time, it did not expand and amplify gradually as it had the last time. No, it burst suddenly at full volume, deafening him and knocking him from his feet. The sound was more powerful here than it had been when he met it before. And Artyom, laid out on the ground, couldn't muster the will to stand for some time. But once he had covered his ears, like before, yelling as loudly as he could, he rushed and got up from the ground. Then he picked up the flashlight that had fallen from Bourbon's hands. He started feverishly to scan the walls, trying to find the source of the noise, the broken pipe. But the pipes were absolutely intact here, and the sound was coming from somewhere above. Bourbon was lying there, immobile, still face down, and when Artyom turned him over, he saw that Bourbon's eyes were still open. Artyom tried hard to remember what to do in situations like this, and he put his hand on the man's wrist to look for a pulse. Even if it was weak as a thread or inconsistent, he wanted to feel it, but it was useless. Then he grabbed Bourbon by the hands and, pouring with sweat, he dragged him his ever heavier body forward, straight out of this place. It was fiendishly hard, and made even more so because he had forgotten to remove his companion's rucksack. After a few dozen steps, Artyom suddenly stumbled on something soft, and his nose was struck by a sickening and slightly sweet smell. He immediately remembered the words, "We might bump into them," and he redoubted his efforts, trying not to look underfoot. Passing bodies stretched out on the rails. He pulled Bourbon along. Bourbon's head hung lifelessly, and his hands were growing cold and slipping out of Artyom's sweaty hands. But he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't want to acknowledge it. He had to get Bourbon out of there, and he had promised him. They had an agreement. The noise gradually began to die down and suddenly disappear. Again there was a deathly silence, and feeling an enormous relief, Artyom allowed himself to finally sit down on the rails and catch his breath. Bourbon was lying motionlessly next to him, and Artyom was looking with despair at his pale face as he breathed heavily. After about 5 minutes, he made himself get up onto his feet, and taking Bourbon by the wrist, he moved forward, stumbling. His hand was absolutely empty, apart from the vicious determination to drag this person to the next station. Then his legs buckled and he tumbled onto the cross ties, but after lying there for a few minutes, he crawled forward and grabbed Bourbon by the collar. "I'll get there. I'll 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 get there." He assured himself, although he barely believed it. Having lost his strength entirely, he pulled his machine gun down from his shoulder and switched the safety lock to single shots, and he directed the barrel to the south, let out a shot, and called out, "People." But the last sound that he heard was not a human voice, but the rustle of rat paws. He didn't know how long he had laid there like that, gripping Bourbon by the collar, squeezing the handle of his machine gun, when his eyes perceived a ray of light. An unfamiliar old man with a flashlight in one hand and a strange gun in the other was standing above him. "My young friend," he was saying in a pleasant and sonorous voice, "you can forget about your friend. He's as dead as Ramses II. Do you want to stay here and reunite with him in the heavens as soon as possible, or can he wait for you for a little while?" "Help me to take him to the station," Artyom asked the man in a weak voice, covering his eyes from the light. "I'm afraid that it's necessary for us to reject that idea," the man said bitterly. "I am resolutely against turning the metro station of Sokharovskaya into a tomb. It's not even that comfortable as it is. And then, if we take this lifeless body there, then it's unlikely that anyone in the station will undertake to put him in his final path in a respectable way. What difference does it make whether the body decomposes here or at the station if its immortal soul has already returned to his creator, or to be reincarnated depending on your religious views? Although all religions are mistaken to differing degrees, I promised him, Artyom sighed. We had an agreement. "My friend," the unfamiliar man said, frowning, "I'm starting to lose my patience. My rules don't tell me to help the dead when there's enough living people that need help. I'm returning to Sokharovskaya. I'm getting rheumatism from spending a long time in this tunnel. If you want to see your companion as soon as possible, I advise you to stay here. The rats and the other lovely creatures will help you with that. And if you are concerned about the legal aspect of the question, then the contract is considered terminated if there's no objection from the other party." But I can't just leave him here, Artyom quietly tried to convince his rescuer. This was a living being. Leave him to the rats? This, by the looks of it, was indeed a living person, the man responded, inspecting the bodies skeptically. But now it is definitely a dead person. That isn't the same thing, okay? If you want, we can return here and you can make a cremation bonfire or whatever it is that you do in such circumstances. Now get up, he ordered, and Artyom got to his feet reluctantly. Despite his protests, the stranger decisively pulled the rucksack off Bourbon's back and threw it over his shoulders, and supporting Artyom, he quickly walked forward. At first, Artyom had a hard time walking, but it was as if with each step the old man was giving Artyom injections of his ebullient energy. The pain in his feet subsided, and his rational mind returned gradually. He was looking intently into the face of his rescuer. By the looks of him, the man was over 50, but he looked surprisingly fresh and robust. His arms, which were supporting Artyom, were firm and didn't once tremble with fatigue the whole way back. His short hair was turning gray, and his little scalp beard surprised Artyom. The man looked too well groomed for the metro, especially given the godforsaken place where it seemed that this man lived. What happened with you, friend? The unfamiliar man asked Artyom. It doesn't look like an attack, but more like he was poisoned. And I really want to hope that it's not what I think it is, he added, not going into what exactly it was he feared.